So my name is Arsenio. I am the secretary of Pi Gamma Mu Honor Society, and Pi Gamma Mu is a honor society for individuals for social science with a 3.0 or above. That is a junior or a senior. So today we got David Gilmour, Deputy Assistant Secretary. Mr. Gilmour was Deputy Chief of Mission. His other overseas assignments included officer in Douala, Cameroon, and junior officer at Dakar, Senegal. His work. Mr. Gilmour joined the Foreign Service in 1986 and attained the rank of Minister Counselor in 2010. Give it up for David Gilmour.
Thanks everyone for coming on today. I'm here to talk about Africa, and I work on Africa. As you heard, I've worked in a lot of places around the world, but I spent about half of my career in the Foreign Service, the diplomatic service of the U.S., working in Africa. So I'm here to tell you about some of the exciting things going on in Africa, some of what the United States policy priorities are for Africa, and then I'll talk about a couple of interesting initiatives we got going on. Good. So I think for me, this is, having worked in Africa for now, it's 29 years I've been in the Foreign Service. I think this is the most exciting and interesting time that I've seen during my career in Africa. And Africa is a region of the world that's undergoing tremendous change very rapidly, very dynamic, and it's really exciting. And I think if you're interested in Africa, in working there and doing business there, now is the time to go, and it is quite exciting. Let me just mention a few things maybe about Africa that you didn't know, because a lot of Americans, I think, have a perception about Africa, and I think all of us need to kind of adjust our perceptions, because things are really changing there so much. Just a few things. Africa is home right now to some of the world's fastest growing economies. You know, we typically think of China and Asia as the place of fast growing economies. In fact, it's Africa. Right now, depending on whose estimate you follow, it could be as many as 7 or 8 of the top 10 fastest growing economies in the world right now are in Africa. Africa is a continent with a rapidly growing population. There's a boom going on. Africa, by the year 2040, will have the world's largest workforce, surpassing either both India and China. Africa is a young continent, again with this fast-growing population. 60% of the population of Africa today is under the age of 35. So, and in a lot of countries, the median age is 15 years old. So it's quite remarkable how fast the population is growing. A lot of us think of Africa, we think of people living in huts in rural areas and small villages. In fact, Africa is a rapidly urbanizing place. In 1980, about 28% of Africans lived in cities. Today, it's about 40%. And in the next 15 years, that's expected to grow to 50% of Africans living in urban areas. If you go to places like Nigeria, Lagos, a city that has something like 21 million people, and that's almost as big as Mexico City. Big urban areas. Africa is a very rich continent, tremendously wealthy in terms of particularly mineral resources. Africa has 10% of the world's oil, 40% of the world's gold, 50% of the world's diamonds, 80 to 90% of the world's chromium and platinum. Tremendous mineral resources there, and particularly oil and gas are being discovered in all kinds of new places now in different countries because of new technologies. Africa has 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land, so Africa has tremendous potential as an agricultural producer to help feed a growing world. So a lot of interesting things happening, and I think particularly for the people in my business and diplomacy and our relations with Africa, I think there's very much of a new narrative that's changed just in the past few years about Africa. A few years ago, when we talked about Africa, we thought about conflict and the HIV/AIDS crisis and massive debt and the need for ever-increasing aid programs. Now, just a few years later, the conversation has very much changed, and now we talk about fast economic growth. We talk about new technology. We talk about prosperity. We talk about a growing middle class in Africa. One interesting fact, too, most Americans don't know, Africa is the world's fastest growing mobile phone market. In the first 10 years of this decade, African telecom operators added 316 million new customers. That's more than the population of the whole United States. So, and in a lot of countries in Africa, there's more than 100% penetration of mobile phones. There are more phones than there are people. So, quite something. And I think very important for us in the United States, the way that we view our relationship with Africa has changed because of these changes and this change in the conversation. Traditionally, our relationship with Africa has been one of donor and recipient. And we think of the United States as a donor country, African countries as needing assistance from the United States. Now, today, we talk about our relationship with Africa much more as a partnership. And I think that's a major change. So, in terms of our relationship with Africa, our foreign policy priorities, we have four main priorities. In terms of our relationship with Africa, our foreign policy priorities, we have four main priorities. And I'll talk a little bit about each of these. And those four priorities are strengthening democracy, encouraging economic growth and trade, and those two things go hand in hand. They're completely interrelated. Guaranteeing peace and security, trying to resolve conflicts. And then the last priority is what we call promoting opportunity and development. So let me just say a few words about each of those. So on the first one, in terms of promoting democracy, our emphasis there is to build strong democratic institutions. Africa's had democracy now in many countries for better than 20 years. There was kind of an outbreak of democracy, particularly after the fall of the Berlin Wall in the early 90s. South Africa achieved democracy in 1994. So we've seen a lot of democracy across the continent. There's a lot more democracy than there was in the period before, where we saw a lot of one-party states and military governments, that sort of thing. So it's definitely better than it was. There's still a ways to go, and what we still need to do more work on, what African countries need to work on, is building strong democratic institutions. President Obama, when he traveled to Africa in 2009, the first time he went to Ghana, he gave a speech there. That speech has been quoted quite often, but the most famous quote out of that speech was, he said, "Africa doesn't need strong men, it needs strong institutions." And so we've really taken that as our mantra and talked to African governments all the time about the necessity of strengthening democratic institutions. And of course that means that you need to have things like an independent parliament, an independent judicial system, judges that can act independently. You need a vibrant civil society so people can speak out and have their voices be heard. And of course you need a free press, very important. President Obama has really underlined this. One of the interesting projects that I worked on when the president went to Africa the second time in 2013, he made a strong point of emphasizing particularly the need for strong democratic institutions in the sense that he went to Senegal. It was his first stop on that trip, and his first thing he did when he set foot on African soil was to meet with a large group of Supreme Court judges from all over the continent. And what he wanted to do was send the message there that rule of law is so important, and it's the foundation of a democracy, and that we should accord judges the same respect that we accord presidents and prime ministers and parliamentarians, because in fact, they are the third branch of a democratic system, and you can argue they're the most important branch in some ways. So that was a powerful statement, and we've tried to orient some of our exchange programs and other activities to try to strengthen the hand of independent judiciaries in Africa. We also work a lot with civil society, and because having democracy means that governments need to be responsive to their citizens. And the president talks often about this, that all the voices in society need to be heard. Governments need to listen to young people. They need to listen to women. They need to listen to minority groups. Everybody has to have a voice in society. And that's how you can have sustained, peaceful societies. So we talk a lot about that. Another thing that we're talking a lot about these days, in terms of democracy, are term limits, because we believe very strongly that the vitality of a democratic system, you have to have a change of leadership from time to time. And one of the problems we've seen in Africa is that we have sometimes presidents who like the job and they want to stay a long time on the job, and it's important in order for democracy, and especially for a young population that's demanding a voice, for people to be heard. So my boss, the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, speaks out about this quite often, about the need for constitutions to be respected, and for leaders to be ready to give up power and hand over to a successor. And the Constitution is very important. It should not be changed for the benefit of the incumbent, which is certainly an issue in Africa these days. So that's democracy. That's some of the work we do in that area. Economic growth and trade. Again, there's a lot of good news going on in Africa. As I mentioned, some of the fastest growing economies in the world. African governments have liberalized their economies in recent years. They've made macroeconomic reforms. They've cut taxes. In a lot of cases, they've tried to improve the business climate to try to attract more investment. And a lot of new players, other countries have come in to invest in Africa who were not historically there before. So it's a very dynamic atmosphere now in terms of the economies of Africa. And we want to see more American companies go and do business in Africa. This past summer, President Obama hosted a summit of all the African leaders in Washington. That was quite a historic event. It was the first time that the President of the United States had ever invited and received all the heads of state of Africa in a single meeting. So we had that hosted in Washington in August. And one of the centerpieces of that big summit meeting with all those leaders was a CEO forum. We had the Secretary of Commerce and Michael Bloomberg from Bloomberg Philanthropies put together a day-long forum with all those leaders from Africa and 200 American CEOs to try to bring them together to talk about doing business in Africa and to try to really educate American business people about the opportunities that are available in Africa and why they should go and take a look. And then obviously to talk to African leaders and have them get to know American CEOs and American business people. So we think there are a lot of opportunities, particularly in a lot of different sectors. Agriculture, mining, I mentioned the great mineral resources that are there. Manufacturing, with this fast-growing population, there's a tremendous market potentially for consumer goods. And there are already American companies. I was in Cincinnati a couple of years ago and visited Procter & Gamble, and Africa is one of their big global growing markets now because they see that there are potentially 500 million people who are consumers in the next few years. As these economies grow, airlines are doing well. Boeing is selling a lot of airplanes over there. So anything in the transportation sector. And actually, somebody just gave me this morning some statistics, and I was amazed to learn that Texas is actually the #1 state in terms of exports to sub-Saharan Africa, with $7 billion a year in this past year, 2014. And that's more than twice what the next largest state is, which is Washington State, which is Boeing, of course, mainly selling jets to Ethiopian Airlines, Kenya Airways, and some of the bigger airlines there. But that's quite remarkable. But there are some statistics. Somebody just gave me this sheet. I was really surprised to learn, for example, that there are several different sectors and markets where Africa is among the top 20 markets in the world. So, for example, in motor vehicles, Nigeria is the 11th largest market in the world for U.S. exports of motor vehicles. We exported last year $848 million worth of cars to Nigeria. Most people don't know that. That's pretty amazing. Boats. Nigeria is the 7th largest market in the world for boats, particularly work boats. Railways. Companies like GE are investing in Africa in a big way because there's so many mineral resources. Those products are heavy, so they have to be transported by rail. So those are great opportunities for American companies to go and invest in railways there. Agriculture, civil engineering, lots of sectors. So very interesting prospects there, and that's something we really haven't seen until very recently. So very exciting. So that's democracy and economic growth. Turning to our third area of emphasis, as I say, is peace and security. And here there's a couple of different aspects to what we do. One is a kind of traditional diplomacy work where we have diplomats, people like me who do this for their career, who get involved to try to mediate conflicts. Africa is a much more peaceful place today than it was 20 years ago, that's for sure. There are many fewer wars. But there are still some spots of conflict. So we have diplomats who are engaged. We have our ambassadors there. We have special envoys, people engaged in trying to mediate those conflicts, to bring the parties together in places like South Sudan, in places like the Great Lakes area of the Eastern Congo, the Central African Republic. So some of those conflicts lend themselves to mediation, and we do a lot because the influence of the United States is powerful in those kinds of situations. The parties will listen to us in a lot of cases, and we can help bring peace to those kinds of conflicts. The other way that we work on peace and stability is something newer and I think very exciting, and that is to support African countries in looking after their own security. And we do this in supporting things like peacekeeping operations. I'll give you a couple of good examples. One is in Somalia. This is a good example of countries in the neighborhood of Somalia, the neighboring countries taking responsibility to help settle the conflict there. So countries like Ethiopia and Kenya and Burundi and Tanzania have sent troops under an African Union mission to quell the violence in Somalia, to repress the Al-Shabaab terrorists there. And they've done so with funding and support from the United States and other countries, but they are the ones coming up with the strategy, providing the troops, providing the leaders to make it happen. So it's a great partnership, and it's a great example of how the United States can work in partnership with countries on security. Another good example that we had just over the past year was in the Central African Republic. That country kind of fell apart a year ago. It was kind of a civil war situation, but it had a kind of a religious, kind of Muslim versus Christian cast to it, and there was fear at the time that it could be like another Rwanda type of situation, that there could be mass atrocities or potentially even genocide. And again, the African Union stepped up at that time and said, we'll help organize troops, and particularly two countries, Rwanda and Burundi, said we will send troops, and the United States said, okay, we will provide the airlift, the transport, to take those troops in. And so we did that. We took transport aircraft. We transported their troops rapidly. The French also sent some troops into the Central African Republic. We all went in. The situation was calm. Potentially hundreds of thousands of lives might have been saved. And today, hopefully that country is on the way back to a negotiated peace settlement, and peace once again. So another good example of how the United States can play a supporting role with Africans who lead African countries, identifying the needs, strategizing, putting forth resources, and the United States and other Western countries in a supporting role. The last area for emphasis of ours in terms of our policy is what we call opportunity and development. And this relates to a lot of our traditional aid programs. And I'll mention, there are a lot of different programs under this, but I'll mention just a couple I think are particularly noteworthy and important. One is in the area of health. And we started, we've had health programs for many years, but we really ramped up during the Bush administration. President Bush launched an initiative called PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. And this was at a time when the HIV/AIDS crisis was particularly hitting Southern Africa very hard. And President Bush realized that it was to such an extent that crisis that it threatened the stability of those countries, really. Because you had so many people dying of AIDS, particularly from the kind of the most productive part of the population, people in the kind of the most productive years of their lives. So there was a big ramp up of assistance. That has continued under President Obama, and President Obama has further expanded in health programs in other areas, in malaria and tuberculosis. So the United States has really made an important contribution to helping the health of Africans and stabilizing the AIDS crisis. And I think we can all be proud. I mean, there are millions of people alive today in Africa because of the antiretroviral drugs from U.S. programs who would have died otherwise. So, and there's a lot of good news. Malaria is down by 20%. Child mortality is down significantly. So there are definitely positive progress. So that's health. The other area that I might mention in this category is agriculture. And here again, I think we've done a lot, and there's great prospect for Americans to make a contribution in terms of helping African agriculture develop. In terms of having more private sector involvement in agriculture there, and also introducing new technology. So there's exciting prospects there. And then lastly, let me mention one other initiative that we've been working on with Africa that I think is really interesting and exciting, and hopefully could involve some of you if you're interested. And that is, it's an exchange program, and this is really in recognition of the fact of what I mentioned about Africa's rapidly growing population and this, what people call a youth bulge of so many young people, 60% of the population being under the age of 35. President Obama realized that, we as Americans need to get to know those leaders of tomorrow in Africa and reach out to those young people, and we need them to know the United States. And so he launched this program called the Young African Leaders Initiative. It started in 2010 when he invited a group of young African leaders to the White House for a 3-day summit. And then out of that has grown other activities, and last year we launched a greatly expanded exchange program for young African leaders. And this new program involves bringing 500 young leaders from across the continent to the United States for leadership training at 20 different American universities and colleges, including UT Austin. So UT hosted one of these groups this past summer. There'll be another group coming this summer. And in next year, in 2016, we plan to double the program to 1,000 people a year. And then we also have private sector participation with companies providing internships and training opportunities for the participants. And we're looking to set up centers in certain places across Africa to try to replicate what these training opportunities on the continent, the same as what people have had in the U.S. So it's an exciting program, and I think what's interesting for me about it is it really responds to the desires and needs of what young Africans themselves want. I mean, I travel around the continent all the time, and I talk to young people, and it's really interesting. And again, this has really changed in recent years. They'll say to me, we don't want a handout from the United States. We don't even want your money necessarily. What we want from you is know-how. Because they know that the United States has, the greatest tertiary education system. Has, they know the United States is the center of innovation and technology, and that's what they want. And they want to build their own countries, but they want some knowledge from us. And so that's what this exchange, this YALI program is designed to do, is to bring some young Africans over here, expose them to that, have them network with Americans to build connections that hopefully when they go home to their home countries and they begin to build their businesses or succeed in their careers, they will turn to Americans as their partners and potentially as investors or in whatever field it might be. So I think it's a really interesting people-to-people exchange, and I'd love to see HDU get involved maybe with UT's aspect of this, and UT is certainly looking to expand its programs with Africa. So I think there's a lot of interest here in Austin to try to increase exchanges. We see South Africa as a really important partner. And South Africa, starting pretty soon after President Mandela came into office, South Africa began to play a role in mediating conflicts, in particular. Countries like Burundi and Congo. And that's incredibly positive. And I worked in Malawi, was my last posting, and I worked very closely with the South African High Commissioner there, the ambassador, because South Africa, of course, has become a donor country in some, giving assistance to some of the poorer countries like Malawi. So that's a very positive development, and we want to work very closely. A good example right now in the eastern Congo, South Africa has troops there as part of a United Nations force to try to, and that UN force is working with the Congolese to try to go after the remnants of the armed groups, particularly one armed group that were the guys who committed the Rwandan genocide 20 years ago. It's a group called the FDLR, this rebel group. So we depend very heavily on South African peacekeepers and troops from other countries to go in and help resolve these conflicts. South Africa, I also would say, has played a really important role in terms of the economic development of the continent. Before 1994, I lived in South Africa in the early 90s, and in those days, I had to have two passports because I had to have one passport to travel to South Africa that had my South African visa in it, and then I had to have another passport to travel to all the rest of the countries in Africa, because if I tried to show up in one of those other countries with a South African stamp in my passport, I would not be admitted. That was the strength of the boycott against South Africa for democracy and the feeling of the other countries towards South Africa. Now that's entirely changed, and now South African Airways flies to every country on the continent practically, and every country you travel to, you see South African banks and supermarkets and mobile phone companies, and I think that's a really positive thing, because South Africa is an economic powerhouse. It can help pull the rest of the continent up with it. South Africa is a country with a strong rule of law and a great democratic tradition. You're on your third president since democracy. So it's setting a great example for the rest of the continent in terms of strong democratic institutions. I'm a great friend of South Africa, and I see it as an important partner. The BRICS. People always ask us about China and Africa. How do we see that? And the question is usually phrased as, are we in competition with the Chinese in Africa? And our answer to that is really no, we're not, because we feel that the size of the market and the needs of Africa are so great that there's room for everyone to come and play a role and invest. And certainly the Chinese have been in Africa now for 10 years or more as major investors. Not just the Chinese, the Brazilians, the Indians, the Turks. Turkish Airlines now flies to like 25 cities in Africa. So that it's really interesting how many new emerging countries are coming to Africa to play a role. And we think that's all good. Africa has tremendous need for infrastructure development. The Chinese are there building a lot of roads and hotels and things, and that's great. I think the World Bank says that there's a need for something like $80 billion annually in infrastructure development in Africa. So there's room for everybody. Our only message to African countries is that before you accept a foreign investor, whether it be the United States or China or anybody else, make sure that the deal that you're doing is good for your people, because there have been kind of accusations or discussions that maybe some countries are looking to come to Africa to exploit it for its resources and not kind of leave something behind in terms of human capital development. So that's really our message. Boko Haram, this is this extremist group in northern Nigeria that's causing a lot of problems for Nigeria and now for the countries around it as well. A few things on that. We've told the Nigerians in particular for quite a while now that we think this problem doesn't have a purely military solution, that they need to take a comprehensive approach, that the northern part of Nigeria has been historically very underdeveloped, and that an extremist group has a lot, can take advantage of a situation like that, if the population is neglected. So our message to the Nigerians is, look at the north, look at development, look at social service delivery, to make sure that the population in the north of Nigeria is on the side of the rest of Nigeria that feels like it's part of Nigeria, and so that they will be less sympathetic to the extremists. But clearly, it's a problem that needs a military solution as well. And so we've encouraged Nigeria to work with the neighboring countries, Cameroon and Niger and Chad, to work together to try to confront Boko Haram and get it under control. With the election in Nigeria, we were disappointed to see that they postponed the election, and we've said publicly that they shouldn't postpone it anymore, that they should go on and hold the election in 6 weeks' time. And Nigeria is again a country that has had strong democratic tradition. 20 years ago, it had military governments. Now it's had strong democracy, and we want to see that continue.
Mr. Gilmour, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
The State Department